Author and pastor Joseph Stowell submitted this story, a true story, in a magazine called the Moody Monthly. An anonymous contributor to that issue. We were on our family's annual Christmas trek to Chicago. Each year, we brought our family to spend time with Grandma and Grandpa and visit the museums. This year, we decided to finish our Christmas shopping at the suburban Woodfield Mall. I guess if anybody's from Chicago, maybe that's familiar. In the midst of all the fun and excitement, one of us noticed that little 3.5-year-old Matthew was gone. Terror immediately struck our hearts. We had heard the horror stories, little children kidnapped in malls, rushed into a restroom, dressed in different clothes and an altered hairstyle, and then swiftly smuggled out, never to be seen again. We split up, each taking an assigned location. Mine was the parking lot, and I'll never forget that night, kicking through the new fallen snow, calling out Matthew's name at the top of my lungs. I felt like an abject fool, yet my concern for his safety outweighed all other feelings. Unsuccessful, I trudged back to our meeting point. My wife, Marty, had not found him, nor had my mother. Then my dad appeared, holding little Matthew by the hand. Our hearts leapt for joy. Interestingly enough, Matthew was untraumatized. He hadn't even been crying. To him, there had been no problem. I asked my father where he found him. The candy store, he replied. You should have seen him. His eyes came just about as high as the candy. He held his little hands behind his back and moved his head back and forth, surveying all the luscious options. Matthew didn't look lost. He didn't know he was lost. He was oblivious to the phenomena and the danger he was in. This is a candy counterculture where people who don't look lost and don't know they're lost live for consumption. Interesting story. Jesus traveled with his parents, as was their annual custom, to go down south to Jerusalem from up north, Nazareth, walking typically with a caravan, roughly a 90-mile journey. Took about 4 or 5 days. And Jesus being 12 years old, this would have been the 12th time that he would be in Jerusalem, as he was at his birth. And Mary and Joseph and Jesus joined literally thousands of pilgrims making the trek, going from Nazareth to Jerusalem, and then joining others who came from all over the Roman Empire. Hundreds of thousands, it's estimated. Why? Well, Passover. Passover is the celebration of the Jewish people, still celebrated today, to commemorate an event that happened 4,000 years ago in our time, 2,000 years before the time of Joseph, Mary, and Jesus. And to remember that on the night God would deliver the people of Israel through the Red Sea and into eventually the Promised Land, they were to do something. God had tried to get Pharaoh's attention by sending plague after plague after plague. You know, the frogs, the gnats, the bloody water, the hail, the darkness, all the plagues. And the last one was the plague of the firstborn son. All people, not just Jewish people, were invited, or admonished is a better word, to sacrifice a lamb and to take some of the blood and wipe it over the entrance to the door. And when the blood of the Lamb was seen by the angel God sent to do what God warned would happen, that angel would pass over that house. So Passover is celebrated to commemorate that event. Of course, Mary, Joseph, and as a child and a boy, the Holy Family had no idea that fast forward 18 years or so, Jesus would become the Passover lamb. He would be sacrificed up on a wooden cross for the sins of the world, yours and mine. There was lots of time on the journey to have fellowship with family members, friends who were making the same trip. And no doubt Joseph and Mary looked forward to catching up on family news and sharing and having fellowship, sharing meals together. And after the Passover, they head back. And let me reread that section of Luke's Gospel that talks about that one more time. After the festival was over, while his parents were returning home, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem. But they were unaware of it. Thinking he was in their company, they traveled on for a day. Day number 1. Then they began looking for him among the relatives and friends. When they didn't find him, they went back to Jerusalem, day 2, to look for him. And on 3 days, so day number 3, 3 days later, that is after Jesus was discovered not to be in the caravan, they found him sitting in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them, asking them questions. Interesting side note here. In the story of Moses and the burning bush, who was it that appeared to Moses in the appearance of flame inside a large shrub that didn't get burned? It's thought it was the pre-incarnate Son of God who spoke to Moses and who would repeatedly speak to Moses for 40 days up on the mountain when many believe Jesus gave Moses the 10 Commandments. And so the laws and the interpretations of the laws that Jesus had in his pre-incarnate state given to Moses in the first place 2,000 years before are being talked about and shared by the leading teachers and the theologians and the scholars and the rabbis of the day. Now, as a human being, Jesus had chosen to limit his memory and his understanding, so he was relearning as a human what he already knew as the Son of God. In any event, God, the Son of God, was lost. God was lost. What happened? Well, likely Joseph and Mary, in their journey back home, and this would be the 12th time they traveled from Jerusalem back up to Nazareth, right? Why would they insist that Jesus stay right next to them, for 90 miles? After all, he had cousins, young boys, young girls that he could visit with and talk with. And so they assumed that he was doing that he was with others in the caravan. By the way, another side note, one of Jesus' cousins was a boy named John. And John would become John the baptizing prophet. Now, no doubt Jesus and John didn't talk about all that. They weren't fully aware of it at that point. But that's the context of the relationships that Jesus grew up with as a boy, as a preteen, as a 12-year-old. One day on, 90 miles divided by 4 or 5 days is roughly 20 miles. So Mary and Joseph, it's thought, in the caravan, got as far as 20 miles away, heading back north to Nazareth. How far, and it was typically an 8-hour trip during full daylight. People didn't travel in the dark for fear of marauders, wolves, wild animals. If you had an 8-hour time frame and could take a trip from here to anywhere you wanted to go, roughly at 60 miles an hour, what are some of the places you might be able to reach in one traveling day for an 8-hour drive? Well, I'll give you a few suggestions in case you're planning one and didn't know where to go. I lost my place. Oh, here it is. Okay. Bozeman or Billings, Montana. All right. Rapid City, South Dakota. Lubbock or El Paso, Texas. Death Valley, California. Salt Lake City. Even beyond Phoenix, all the way to Tucson, or one of my favorite places that I want to see that I've never seen because I love the movie, a place called Tombstone. The Wyatt Earp episode. All right, so Joseph and Mary arrive back in Jerusalem, likely the evening of the second day, and on the third day they start looking around. And finally, as anxious as they were, as terrified, just like the illustration of the couple in Chicago, in the Chicago suburb. Back then, Jerusalem was not a safe town, especially for preteens on their own without any parental supervision. Slavery was perfectly legal in the Roman Empire. Children of the age of Jesus, 12, were sometimes sold into slavery when the parents of a family needed the money. And unfortunately, some of those children were not only inhumanely treated in working conditions that we can't even imagine in our day, but some were sold into prostitution, boys and girls. No doubt, Mary and Joseph were worried, to say the least. So they walk up to the huddle, and they may have noticed some of the leading theologians and rabbis and teachers in Israel. And they walk up and they hear people talking, and then likely they heard the voice, a familiar voice, asking the most learned teachers in Israel a question. And they knew. Joseph and Mary knew. It was Jesus. They found Jesus. They had lost Jesus. God was lost for Mary and Joseph, and all their relatives who were up in the caravan who likely continued on their way. But they found him. What happened next? You're probably thinking they apologized to Jesus for not double checking to see if he was actually in the caravan heading north, right? Yeah. No, wrong. They didn't do that. With Joseph's silent agreement, no doubt, Mary, the mother, typically the Hebrew mothers always talk to the kids, and the dad would just let it be. Son, why have you treated us like this? Why have you, Jesus, the Son of God, the one they knew was miraculously born through a miraculous conception, the one who the angels proclaimed, the one whom the shepherds came to visit, the one who the wise men 2 years later in Bethlehem came to visit and gave him gifts only given typically to royalty, gold and myrrh and frankincense. The one who almost got killed by Herod when Herod ordered the massacre of infants in and around Bethlehem. God warned them, they went to Egypt. They are blaming the same Jesus who God was protecting. And they brought, as the New Testament narratives say, an angel appeared again to Joseph and brought the family back. And they settled down once again in Nazareth, where they were living. God was lost. As far as Mary and Joseph were concerned, it was God's fault. Why did you treat us like this? Ever feel that way? Yeah. Yeah. We lose God. We make a disconnect. We go to church on Sunday and maybe another Christian activity during the week. Then we get caught up with life and family and friends and activities. And the next thing we know, we've left God in the temple, in the sanctuary. Where is God? And if something bad happens to us when we're not in full fellowship with God, seeking God, and believing God allows bad things happen to good people, we blame God. It's human nature. It has to be somebody's fault. It can't be our fault. Or it can't be somebody else's fault who committed an evil act. God, why did you let this happen? A friend of mine who was a fellow pastor years ago went through a very, very difficult time. His son was born with a chromosomal disorder and basically would be way behind the boys his age in school. And so as time went on, my friend basically said, God, if this is what you do, I'm done. And he resigned from his church. He resigned from Christianity. He became an atheist. And he still is to this day, but we converse and stay in touch. But a lot of people do that. When something awful happens, we think that God did it and God is directly responsible because, well, if God is God, he could have prevented it. But I want to remind us, rewind all the way back to Eden, the Garden of Eden. What happened? With their free will, Eve and Adam, and however you interpret that story, the Genesis account is that they basically broke covenant with God. And God basically responded by saying, all right, if you want to live apart from my word and my law and do your own thing and do what you want to do, okay. But because I love you, I will give you a prophecy. The seed of the woman will crush the head of the serpent. The seed of the woman will crush the head of the serpent. So when you read the Gospel of Matthew and I think Luke, you read the genealogy of Jesus is traced all the way back to David and to Abraham and then all the way back to Adam and Eve. Who's the seed of Eve that crushed the serpent, another word for the devil? Jesus on the cross. Jesus triumphed over sin and evil and the tyranny of sin. God didn't do what humankind did. Humankind did what God did to humankind. We can't blame God. We can blame other people who are criminals or who did something wrong, but we can't blame, well, we can, but we're mistaken. When we lose Jesus, how do we feel? What goes through our minds? We're afraid of things. When we realize we've been living apart from immediate fellowship with Jesus Christ, even though we're still Christians and we're still, saved, we can still lose fellowship with God, right? Every time we sin, we do that. So we fear, oh no, or we feel alone, or we become angry, thinking that it was God's fault. We blame God. We lose God. God is lost, as far as we're concerned. Mary and Joseph fell into that progression of fear and anxiety and worry. And when they got to Jesus, they apologized for being irresponsible parents, leaving him in Jerusalem while they went back home. No, they didn't. Imagine if the story had said, when Mary and Joseph found Jesus in the temple, they apologized. Jesus, Son of God, we screwed up. Right? Yeah. I mean, if Jesus was any other child who could have become a victim of some of the things happening in first century Rome, the same kinds of things that happen in 21st century our world, wow. God never gets lost. If he did, he wouldn't be God. Who gets lost? You do, I do. Yes, pastors lose God. And yet God never gets lost, and God never gives up on us. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. So we could just interpret the words of the hymn, I got lost. I lost God. But God's amazing grace found me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. Earlier, we heard the words from Jeremiah the prophet, where the Lord spoke to Jeremiah and said, I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a future and a hope. Then you will call upon me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you search for me with all your heart. I will be found by you, saith the Lord. God loves us so much, he leads us back to the temple, if you will, of Jerusalem. He leads us right back, right smack dab in the presence of Jesus, as Jesus promised. Where two or more are gathered in my name, I'm there. So when we lose Jesus, one of the best things we can do is dial up a friend. Where two or more are gathered, there am I, in the midst. Even in the middle of a phone call, we can experience fellowship. Jesus is there somehow through the smartphone, cyberspace phenomena. God never stops loving us. What a wonderful God we serve.